Thank you for joining NLADA's webinar for today's discussion on the broken promise of the Sixth Amendment, fixing the right to counsel in America. Good afternoon. I am April Frazier Kamara, President and CEO of National Legal Aid and Defender Association. As many of you all may know, NLADA has been advocating on behalf of access to counsel for more than 100 years in America. We are really excited today to have this very important discussion regarding the Sixth Amendment right to counsel in America. First, we would like to thank Congressman Deutsch for introducing H.R. 1408, the Ensuring Quality Access to Legal Equal Defense Act. If passed, the Equal Defense Act would enable public defenders to maintain manageable caseloads and support pay parity between public defenders and prosecutors. On the 59th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright, NLADA was excited to deliver a letter to the House of Representatives and to Congress asking for support of the Equal Defense Act. That letter was signed by more than 37 large corporations urging Congress to support the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. And so on today, we are really excited to have a diverse conversation around what does the right to counsel in America mean. And we are so excited to have different parts of our community join in that conversation today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Jim Chosey, who is the chair of our Corporate Advisory Committee. Jim, I'm turning it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, April. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see all of you, if only virtually. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this really important conversation. As April mentioned, my name is Jim Chosey. I'm the General Counsel of U.S. Bank. If you've not heard of us, we are one of the largest commercial banks in the United States. We're headquartered right here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have over 70,000 employees across the country that serve communities large and small. And I am here today in my capacity as a very proud board member of NLADA, but also, as April mentioned, as chair of its Corporate Advisory Committee, which is a group of leading corporations like U.S. Bank that support the work and the mission of NLADA. And some of you may be surprised to know about corporate support for NLADA and may wonder why the corporate community would be involved with this organization, which many of you know is the nation's oldest nonprofit devoted to excellence in the delivery of legal services to those who cannot afford them. Excuse me. And for me, I think the reason is rather simple and straightforward, and it's about community. The business community, if you think about it, is part of the fabric of the broader community, and businesses like ours cannot be healthy and they can't be strong unless the broader community, the community as a whole, is healthy and strong. And businesses like U.S. Bank are in the business of serving our communities, which include our workers, our customers, and various other constituents. And responsible businesses try to conduct themselves as responsible citizens of their community by investing in the community and helping to build a better future for everyone. And I think banking in particular has always been known as kind of a cornerstone of the community, helping tend to financial and economic needs. Fundamental to that strong community that I'm describing is a very high functioning system of justice, and one that works fairly and equally well for all concerned, and a system that people can trust and that they can depend upon and have faith in, and fundamentally a system that protects the basic rights of its most vulnerable citizens. And public defense, as we're here to talk about today, is really integral to that kind of a system. Unfortunately, while the constitutional right to counsel for indigent defendants was established, as April said, nearly 60 years ago now in Gideon versus Wainwright, the full promise of that case really has not yet been fully realized because our system of indigent defense is often very much overburdened and underfunded. And we just don't have enough public defenders to meet the needs of the system. And those that we do have are heavily burdened with too many cases and not enough resources to manage their caseloads. And they're also not paid fairly and competitively for the work that they do. So that unfortunate reality, which is this broken promise of the Gideon case, has a lot of adverse consequences. You're going to hear about some of them today, including things like wrongful convictions, unjust sentences, and many other avoidable impacts that really devastate our most vulnerable citizens and in turn devastate our communities. And we're here today to talk about how we can start to think about fixing that promise and how to make the Sixth Amendment right to counsel really mean what it says, and how to ensure that our system of public defense works as it's supposed to. Part of that conversation will be the Equal Defense Act, which again, April referenced, which is pending federal legislation that can help ensure equal justice for all concerned through equal defense as our system requires. So with that introduction, I'm very pleased to introduce our very esteemed panel, and each of them are going to share more about their own experiences and help all of us understand why support for the Equal Defense Act is so critically important. So first, I'm pleased to introduce Ronald Simpson Bay. Ronald is the Executive Vice President of an organization called Just Leadership USA. And they and he are dedicated to criminal justice reform by educating, elevating, and empowering the people and the communities most impacted by systemic racism and trying to drive lasting change. Ronald's a national leader on the subject of decarceration, and he's also personally committed to helping cut the incarcerated population in half by the year 2030. Ronald joins us today from Detroit, Michigan. So welcome, Ronald. Delighted to have you with us. Next up, we have Stan Herman. Stan is the Executive Director of New York County Defender Services, which is one of the country's premier public defender offices. And it was founded in 1997, and to date has represented more than 300,000 clients in Manhattan's criminal court system. And Stan is one of the country's leading criminal defense lawyers, and he serves with various bar association and other organizations supporting public defense and equal justice. Next up, we have a pinch hitter in Allison Bloomquist. Allie is here pinch hitting for Martisha Johnson, who was originally scheduled to be with us. Martisha is the Chief Public Defender for Nashville Defenders. She was scheduled to join our panel, but unfortunately had a last-minute conflict. So we're delighted to have Allie filling in for her. Allie is currently with NLADA. She serves as the Vice President for Strategic Alliances and Innovation, but she's also a formerly practicing public defender, having served over 20 years in that capacity, including most recently with Connecticut and as Director of Training and Education for Connecticut Public Defender Service. And before Connecticut, she was in Boston, where she spent many years in public defense. So Allie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to all of our panelists here today. So with that introduction, we're going to kind of jump right into the conversation. And Ronald, if I could, I'd love to start with you and ask if you wouldn't mind just sharing some of your own personal story and your own experience with deep injustice. And as part of that, why you see public defense as such an important component of broader criminal justice reform.
Thank you so much, Jim, and the NLADA for organizing this conversation. Greetings and welcome. I'm actually calling it from Phoenix, Arizona, where I live now. I was previously in Detroit. As Jim stated, I am Ronald Simpson Bay, the Executive Vice President for Just Leadership USA, and we are the only national criminal justice reform organization that was founded and operated by people directly impacted by the criminal legal system. Just Leadership was founded on the principle that those closer to the problem are closer to the solution, but furthest from the resources and power to effectuate impact and change in their communities. Our mission is to amplify the power of directly impacted people by educating, elevating, empowering, and centering their voices so they have the tools and resources to self-organize and advocate for themselves, their families, and their communities. Together, we will build a fair, equitable, and just America. As part of my story, I come to this work and to this panel as someone who directly experienced the injustices of our system. I served 27 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections on a wrongful conviction from 1985 until 2012, when my conviction was overturned by the federal courts and I was subsequently released. with no compensation and nothing more than oops and a handshake. I used to tease with Just Leadership's founder, Glenn Martin, that after spending so many years in prison, if I got any closer to the problem, it was going to kill me. So we don't have time for me to share the laundry list of things that, I went through in prison. But what I did learn very clearly is that the criminal justice system in America is starkly divided along racial and economic lines. I'm sure everybody knows that. As the founder of Just Leadership used to tease me, I used to tease them and said the most successful and longstanding prison diversion program in America is white skin and money. Seeking and getting justice is almost an insurmountable task for the communities of color and poor people once they find themselves ensnared in our criminal legal system. The vast majority of them depend on the public defender to ensure that they receive fair, just, and equitable treatment. However, under the present system and conditions in our country, their desire is basically a pipe dream. What we need is a criminal justice system, and by extension, a public defender system that is built on social justice, parsimony, compassion, citizenship, and proportionality. The same values we afford certain other Americans when they find themselves ensnared in handcuffs in the legal system. And because of their role in protecting the Sixth Amendment constitutional right to a fair trial for poor and disadvantaged people, the public defender system is such an important and vital part of criminal justice reform in America, and we need to give them the resources and tools to do a better job and to lessen the burden that they have in trying to do so. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Ronald. Wonder if I could just ask a follow-up and see if you could add, just from your own personal experience, having worked with or known others that have worked with public defenders. I'd just be curious as to your perspective on that.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I was thinking about an example as you were asking that question. And in Michigan, I became a paralegal while I was inside. So I worked on a lot of cases, criminal appeal cases for people. And a good friend of mine, he had a public defender. He was had been convicted of first-degree murder, Brinks truck robbery. He had a natural life sentence and a couple other life sentences that he was doing. And so when I was reading his trial transcript and discovered a lot of improprieties in this case, and I reached out to the public defender who represented him, the public defender explained that he was just overworked, overwhelmed. And this particular case was such a huge case because it involved a Brinks truck robbery. He just didn't have the resources to properly, defend this guy. And so by extension, this guy was appointed an appellate counsel, which is similar to the defender's appointed public defender. And so I wrote up a brief for him, an issue on one of the issues that he had that his attorney had missed. And the appellate defender was so miffed by me writing up the issue. I sent it to him, I said, put this in his appeal and filed it. They refused to do so and said that a jailhouse lawyer couldn't, tell them anything about how to represent a case. Lo and behold, about 9 months later, when the Michigan Supreme Court ruled on it, they reversed the conviction on the issue that I wrote and said that the rest of the issues had no merit. So my point is that those closer to the problem are closer to the solution, and that public defenders should listen to their clients when they have things to input, because their lives is at stake. So they definitely going to be forthcoming with, the issues that affect them most.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And maybe just one more follow-up. Sorry, Ronald. I find your personal story so compelling, but could you just add a little bit to the conversation about just the consequences, many of which may be obvious, but many not, about the consequences of unfair and unjust outcomes for families, for communities, and for individuals as well. I think it's important that people think about that as we talk about this broken promise and what we can do to fix it.
I mean, each of our unfair outcomes, there are currently 45,000 collateral consequences in the United States to having a felony conviction. 45,000. I mean, I haven't even seen the list. I can't even imagine 45,000 collateral consequences. So that is the foundation on which, people coming home have to build their lives. It's an ever moving landscape. It's ever moving, just like sand under their feet. They try to do one thing right and they get slammed for doing it for some other reason. But I guess for me, the basic necessities are often overlooked when people return from home. And by that, I mean things like housing, transportation, food, these types of things, because people coming home, they don't have these things. And you think that just because you've been living in society, it seems like automatic, people have these things, but they don't. And when you don't have a good place to lay your head, it's hard to put in a job. apply for a job. You don't have a good address. People don't have the skills to write resumes. They need community support to help put in resumes, to get jobs, to get food, and to get support as they get back on their feet. So if we could just provide just basic human needs, basic human rights services to the people coming home, we have a much more higher success rate of people being successfully returning to our communities instead of returning to crime to try to support themselves.
Got it. Thank you so much, Ronald. Appreciate all of that. And we're going to come back to you. So thank you. Allie, I wonder if I could turn to you next and ask you, as you think back on the work you did for many years as a public defender and this problem we're talking about of too many cases, not enough resources, what kinds of things were you not able to do or not able to provide? And I'm sure the list is long, but if you could just add some color to that for the group, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, so first I have to say, I have had the privilege of working in different jurisdictions as a public defender. And in each of those jurisdictions, there were different, there were caseload protections in one of the places that I worked where I had caseloads that were relatively manageable. And then in another place where I worked, there were not. And I can tell you that even in places with caseload protections, they're always bursting at the seams, right? There's still so much we could be doing by virtue of the volume of cases that are brought into the criminal courts in the first place. The first things that suffer are investigation, proper investigation early in a case. Oftentimes triage means that you're not able to devote energy and attention to investigating a case until it gets closer to trial. And by that time, you're dealing with stale evidence, stale memories. You know, it's never ideal. The other issue is that oftentimes our court structures are plea mills because the reality is our courts are not designed to take all of these cases to trial. We would screech to a halt, and instead pleas are incentivized and oftentimes pressured upon individuals who come before the criminal legal system. And you're dealing with, do I try to resolve this case without this adequate investigation, without the disclosure that I'm in, the discovery that I'm entitled to? And really the people who suffer are clients because we don't spend the time, we don't have the time to meet with clients in ways to address what are their goals. You know, the criminal legal proceeding is one piece of a bigger picture and has impacts that far expand beyond the criminal legal court to include collateral consequences, housing, employment. You know, I certainly, when I'm practicing at a caseload that is astronomical, I don't have the resources and capacity to make sure my clients' goals are all solved because I just don't have the time to delve into all that. And when I work in spaces that also don't have institutional resources, in addition to having unmanageable caseloads, then you don't even have people there to support that work and help clients navigate through so many of those issues. And both clients and defenders suffer because what happens is defenders feel frustrated that they're not providing ethical representation and they want to leave. And organizations have invested in training and time with these defenders and then feel frustrated because they're constantly dealing with retention. And the person who suffers the most is the client at the end of that food chain, who is stuck with a rotating stack of attorneys or stuck with attorneys who are so overburdened they can't pay attention to those cases the way that we want to desperately do.
Thank you. So I'm just curious, as a practitioner, how do you even begin to prioritize things when you're dealing with just an overwhelming caseload, as you're describing, each case having, you know, obviously huge significance and consequences for the individuals involved? I'm just curious how you even deal with that. How do you try to prioritize the work?
It is an overwhelming barrage of balancing ethical obligations, balancing what are the most immediate needs. Custody clients are always the most important clients because I want to try and get them out of custody. I want to try and move that case. But there's just no way to keep all of those balls up in the air. I mean, you are inevitably doing a disservice to clients whose cases you can't pay attention to this week, this month, because of the 70 other cases that you're prepping. And, you know, there are all kinds of different ripple effects that happen. I will say the times that I feel the most successful are when I do pay attention to the clients and I invite the clients in as experts and I tap into their resources and their support system and their community. You know, if I have a client writing me, telling me to look into this, I think, oh, that's 2 more hours of research that might be able to help this case that I maybe wasn't going to do. Like, I hope that I would, but when you're dealing with the pressures of so many human lives and so many needs, and you don't have the tourniquet to sort of adjust the flow so that you can keep up, it feels overwhelming and disheartening.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I want to ask you one more follow-up and then move to Stan, but it has to do, and you touched on this a little bit, with just how much variability is there out there in terms of jurisdictions, resources available, resources not available? I'm sure it varies quite a bit, particularly, you know, major metropolitan areas, and as you move out to less populous areas. So I'm just curious what you could share for the group on that subject.
Yeah, it is dramatic. So there are, you know, a handful, maybe approaching a dozen jurisdictions that have done some caseload studies that are trying to grapple with these issues. They tend to be better resourced jurisdictions. There are many, many, many other places that don't even have statewide public defender systems and are relying on contract defenders, which, you know, is a whole nother sort of added layer to why this is so difficult. It really does dramatically vary. And I think you would need a large cross-section of folks to really dive into what are reasonable caseloads from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and how are places processing cases and what does that look like, because it really varies dramatically.
Got it. Thank you, Ellie. Stan, I'd love to move to you, and just listening to Ellie, I wonder if I could start with you to talk a little bit more about what professional life is like for these defenders, these overworked, underpaid defenders. And in particular, how does that impact your ability to recruit and retain talent? You know, the labor market is extremely tight as it is. And I imagine these circumstances that we're talking about and hearing about make it incredibly difficult to attract and retain people to the defender offices.
Absolutely. And thanks for taking the time, Jim, to do this afternoon. We really do appreciate your service and commitment to NOADA. Before I answer your question, I think it's important to step back because while the country as a whole celebrated the elevation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court, it was incredibly disheartening as an individual tasked with leading a public defender office to see the way, you know, some members of Congress and some in the media really viewed and portrayed what it means to be a public defender. And so, you know, I want to talk about what it means to be a public defender. And that is that a public defender is a patriot. In the same way that members of Congress all take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, right? Public defenders do that every day. Of the 10 original amendments to our Constitution, 4 are protected every day by public defenders. 4th Amendment, right? The protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. 5th Amendment, double jeopardy clause. The 6th Amendment, speedy trial and the right to confront witnesses. And of course, the 8th Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishments. And defending those amendments falls on public defenders throughout the country. So they are patriots and they should be celebrated as such. In terms of your question about resources, you know, we do have a range of different resourced public defender offices. Obviously, I'm in New York City. You know, we would be viewed as a well-resourced public defender office. But for example, I've got 16 social workers on staff. But I also heard from a member organization in Louisiana who couldn't relate to the conversation that chief public defenders were having around addressing collateral consequences because she didn't have one social worker on staff. So, you know, I'm going to speak about it from my perspective, but I just want folks to take away that if a well-resourced public defender organization in New York City is having these issues, you can just imagine what it means for rural America, for middle America, and so many jurisdictions where the funding is just wholly inadequate. So, and in terms of the ability to recruit and retain, I think for us, the real issue is retaining public defenders. Because the reality is that as life unravels for individuals, they go from graduating from law school and being young and being single, but eventually they get a partner and maybe they have a child. And what I find is that that's an inflection point. So I have a lawyer who's 4 years out of law school, who we're training and we're investing a lot of resources. And now they have to decide between having a child or continuing to do this work for such low pay. Or perhaps you're ready to buy a house. And again, we're losing lawyers because if they want to buy a home, they have to choose a profession that's going to pay them more. And so these life choices happen to coincide at a time when that public defender is just getting the type of experience and expertise where we need them to handle the most serious cases. And so this kind of public notion of the young public defender, it really stems from an under-resourced office that is simply unable to retain experienced attorneys, because nobody should be forced to choose between having a child or being a public defender, or buying a house and being a public defender. But unfortunately, those are decisions that are being made every day throughout the country. And usually, almost always, the public defender offices are losing when it comes to those life decisions.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks so much for sharing that. I wonder if you could comment as well, as we're thinking and talking about resources and public defender offices, how does that compare to what you see on the other side with prosecutorial offices? Why do you think it's important that there be some parity, or at least we think about and strive for parity between the two?
Absolutely. So, my friend here in the New York County, District Attorney Alvin Bragg, right? His budget is probably about, 10 times the size of my budget. I have 140 staff members. He has about 1,000 staff members. That does not include his law enforcement arm, which is the NYPD, which has 35,000 employees. So in terms of the resources, it's clearly not equitable. And what are the consequences of that, right? Well, Ronald Simpson Bay is a consequence of that, right? When you look at the wrongful conviction cases that are overturned, overwhelmingly what you will find is a lawyer that was overburdened and didn't have the resources and the time to investigate, review discovery, track down every lead in defense of his client. And that's because they're under-resourced. And so you asked Allie about how you prioritize. The example I like to give is that if you think of the medical profession, and so public defenders overwhelmingly do triage work. And if you remember, I'm going to date myself, but if you remember MASH, right, the MASH unit, right, they were doing triage. They were doing whatever they can very quickly to get somebody to a more stable medical environment. And unfortunately, there is no next medical stable environment for our clients, right? So we need to get away from this idea that all we need to do is fund indigent defense to do triage, and start thinking about, well, how about an emergency room, right? How about where we have machinery and doctors and nurses and a bigger staff to address issues? Or how about a hospital, right? Where you can actually, have specialists and take the time to address all of the issues that a patient needs. And if you don't do that, just look at the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that just in New York City, they spend settling police misconduct cases and settling wrongful conviction cases, right? Because we're not investing on the front end. So, as a society, we all benefit by well-funded offices. the Constitution gets defended, right? Clients are not seeing wrongful convictions, excessive sentences. And, you know, as a society, we all do better.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan. Very, very helpful. Ronald, I wanted to go back to you for a moment and just ask, you know, you're obviously involved in a number of initiatives that support incarcerated and also reentering citizens. And I wanted to see if you could share a little bit more with us about what it looks like when the system works. So let's imagine for a moment we have a very well-funded, high-functioning system. What does that look like? And how can we all, you know, properly support people who are involved in the system?
Well, I think Allie and Stan, I mean, they definitely pointed out, you know, what a successful system could look like when they talked about resources. I mean, resources matter. I mean, we asking the public defender get a bad rap because they don't have the resources to perform to the level they need to perform. I'll be honest, because all those years in prison, everybody said, oh, public defenders are nothing. They're worthless. And we come to discover that they don't have the same resources as the state. The state and the prosecutors have almost unlimited resources. It's like asking a high school basketball player to go up against LeBron James, and you know how often he's going to be successful in doing that. I mean, you know, it's an uphill struggle. So from the position of people that are directly impacted, I mean, put more resources in the front end would definitely have better outcomes on the back end. You won't have such long sentences. You won't have as many convictions. You have much more fairer trials and fairer outcomes. People won't be so disheartened by the whole process because they were treated fairly. It's one thing to be treated fairly and get a raw deal, but then be treated unfairly and get a raw deal. I mean, it's a little bit more palatable when you get treated fairly. So that looks like on the ground, people, coming back out, being able to be accepted as productive citizens of society, because people, once you go serve your time, you should have be able to return without all these collateral consequences. The punishment is serving the time. And if you allow them to return to society and accept them back as full citizens instead of all these compartmentalized versions of citizenship that we have in America, as far as voting rights and employment rights and education rights, and all these denials that we have as being directly impacted. Once you have a successful system, you have people that are able to reintegrate successfully, become useful members of society, taxpaying citizens. At Just Leadership, we have a nationwide network of people that have gone through our leadership development training and have been directly impacted. 1,300 people in about 45 states plus Washington, D.C. And what that looks like, some of our elected state representatives, some of our attorneys, some of our mayors of cities, some of our doctors, these are people that have returned to society, run a nonprofit organization. They're being productive members because they had a fair opportunity to return to society because they had the resources that are afforded to people of more privilege. So it just matters. If you level the playing field, you have much better outcomes.
Got it. Makes good sense. Thank you, Ronald. Maybe one last one. I want to go back to Allie and Stan, both of you. Just listening to all of this, I just can only imagine the various stresses and pressures that our public defenders are under in the work they're trying to do and manage the caseloads while being under-resourced and, by the way, underpaid as well. Based on your experience, I mean, how do you keep your lawyers engaged? How do you try to keep morale up? How do you try to support them in not only the work they're doing, the base work, but operating in these incredibly difficult conditions?
Honestly, I think there are two things that any public defender organization can do to help. Again, these are not going to fix all the problems, but to sort of buttress against all of these problems. One is training and professional development, helping people learn how to do this skill better, more efficiently. That certainly helps with the pressure of the learning curve that's very steep in this work, but it also reinvigorates and rejuvenates folks who are really experienced public defenders. It gives those folks an opportunity to come back into the laboratory to work on their craft, to inspire younger folks. And the outshoot of that is that it builds community. It builds community amongst the folks who are doing this work together. And that leads me to the second part, which is, I think defenders who are the most engaged and able to sustain are ones who are connected to the community they serve. So they are connected to their clients and they're connected to the communities their clients come from. They're invested in working and building those relationships with that community. I think that there's a lot of that, honing the trial skill and improving the interpersonal connection are two wonderful things that make public defense so amazing. And that is one way we're able to keep folks excited and eager and supported in the work. And, it's one way someplace like NLADA is so great because it pulls together so many folks from across the country experiencing this same challenge.
Yeah, and I would just add that when we talk about funding, let's just talk about case caps. And I know Ali has alluded to it. And what are we talking about when we talk about case caps? There are jurisdictions, Louisiana, Missouri, Kentucky, Connecticut. I mean, I could go on and on that have no case caps. So you can have public defenders who are carrying 300 cases at any given time. That's 300 clients. That's 300, discovery that you have to review on 300 cases. That's 300 families that you have to be in contact with and manage. And that, more than anything, is what leads to burnout. So in New York State, we instituted case caps, thanks to our chief judge, Justice Littman at the time in 2010. And there's only two ways that you can reduce case caps of public defenders. One is arrest less people. Well, that's not really in our control. Or two, you hire more lawyers. And you hire more lawyers, if you're doing the same number of cases, the case caps went down. So that's what Justice Littman did. He got us $50 million so we can, in New York City, hire additional lawyers. And finally, we saw case cap numbers that were around 220, and we saw those numbers over time start to get to 150, then 120, and then 110. And so that not only alleviates the immense pressure and stress that public defenders face every day, but it really allows them to put the kind of energy and time and attention that is needed into every single case. When I was a young public defender in New York City, I remember the number. I peaked at 224 cases at one time. Today, thanks to case caps and the investment that New York City has made in indigent defense, my lawyers have a case cap number of about 55 to 60. That's where we need to be. That is manageable. That's when you have the time and the energy and the resource to put the work in. But like I said earlier, Jim, that's just one part of it. If you're not paying them so that they can do this work long-term and look at it as a career that they can do for 20 years, then you're going to lose them. And then you have to retrain young lawyers and start all over again. And that is a very difficult way to manage the public defense system. And it's not fair for the individuals who are being represented on very serious cases by sometimes very inexperienced lawyers. I will never forget, there was a woman when I started who I believe was in North Carolina, and her first month out of law school was given death penalty cases to handle. 1 month out of law school, and she's representing individuals on death row. That still happens today, and that has to change.
Wow, very, very frightening. Thank you, Stan. Thank you so much. So we've got one question from the audience that I want to pose to our panelists, and I'll just ask each of you in turn. And Stan, maybe I'll start with you since you sort of had the floor here. But the question is, as we're talking about funding public defenders, would we be better served perhaps to look at and talk about funding on things like housing and healthcare and some of the other societal conditions, if you will, that cause some of the challenges for the broader legal system? Just wondering for you to share, Stan, your perspective on that question.
So my response is amen. Yes, those investments would have a huge impact. Unfortunately, the reality is that mental health and homelessness, right, gets treated in the criminal legal system. And so we see it in New York City. Mayor Adams has instituted a very aggressive approach toward what he deems to be homeless encampments. The idea is that they're going to do outreach and these folks are going to go to the shelters. And instead what's happening is that they're getting arrested and we're seeing them. And so public defenders every day have to combat the homelessness crisis. Public defenders every day have to combat the mental illness crisis in this country. And so while I agree 100% with the sentiment, we have to be realistic and understand that until that real investment is done on the front end, public defenders are going to continue to be the place, and our courts are going to continue to be the place where these issues are dealt with.
Thank you. Thanks, Stan. Allie, could I go to you for thoughts on that same question?
I mean, I think Stan covered how I feel as well. It's a yes and the reality is, though, to Stan's point earlier, unless the numbers of cases come down, we're not shifting resources. So if the idea where we can shift resources, we can fund fewer public defenders because we can take some money out of the criminal legal system by having fewer cases that are charged as criminal infractions, by having fewer folks, more folks diverted. And then we would, I think, have wonderful amounts of resources we could divert, but it has to be a yes and.
Got it. Thank you. And Ronald, how about you? Just any thoughts on this question of funding one versus, I guess I was going to say the other, but one versus many other needs?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the question in the chat, and I kind of took the question to mean, funding one or the other, or, putting more focus on one or the other. And that's kind of what we've been doing to this point. And from my perspective of what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and expecting different results. We have to do, like Allie said, both need to be supported, equally supported. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have the same outcome that you've already have, because that's kind of what we're doing now. So I think we should focusing more on resources on the front end as well as the back end. Because if you look at the quote unquote advantaged community, they don't ask that question to those that have resources. Well, should we focus more on the front end or the back end? They got resources on both ends. And so the disadvantaged community should have the same resources on both ends as well.
Got it.
Jim, and if I can just share,
please.
On this issue of, folks leaving at 5 or 6 years, what's really heartbreaking about not being able to retain the talent is that more often than not, there are attorneys in tears in my office when they leave. They are not leaving because they want to leave. They are not leaving because, their heart and their dedication to this work has dissipated. They are leaving because they just don't have the financial ability to remain. When you look at, student loans, when you look at the price of law school, I have a 20-year-old daughter who unfortunately doesn't want to go into corporate finance, Jim. She wants to go to law school. And so I looked at my alma mater because I was curious. When I was at NYU School of Law, the motto was, all you need is $100,000 and a dream. NYU is now $275,000 for 3 years. So imagine my daughter decides to do that and takes out all these loans and then wants to be a public defender like her dad. $275,000 has to be paid back. And so, we just have to invest in our public defender offices. The financial ask that we're asking of Congress, I figured it out. I believe it's 0.00019 of the federal budget. This is not a lot of money, but I think when you look at the bang for the buck, when you make this investment, I think Congress and all of our communities will be better off.
Well said. Thank you so much, Stan. So with that, I think I'm going to thank each of our panelists, Stan, you, Allie, and Ronald, so much for joining us here today, but for your insights and for your willingness to share your incredibly powerful personal experiences. Just been quite compelling, and I'm sure has been really informative for the audience here today. With that, April, I think I'm going to hand it back to you and see if you have any closing thoughts or comments for the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. First of all, I want to say thank you to the panel. And thank you for all of the participants. Just our panelists, we had overwhelming retention. So many people have stayed throughout this conversation. And so I want to say thank you. One thing that we know for sure as a community at NLADA, that one's access to justice should not be dependent on your zip code or the amount of money that you have in a bank account, or for people who don't have bank accounts that you just have within your family. And so our fight at NLADA to make sure that every person who is accused of a crime has access to not just representation, but zealous, effective representation is a fight that we are so excited to be engaged in. So as Stan mentioned, the Equal Defense Act would create a grant program for $250 million, which is a small amount of the federal budget, to support state, local, and tribal governments and for public defense. And this funding would specifically be targeted towards addressing the caseload issue in the public defense community and also pay parity. So for you who have joined us today, if you want to learn more about the Equal Defense Act, please reach out to NLADA and we're happy to share more resources, but this is the time for us to push specifically Congress and the federal government to do something to address the broken premise of the Sixth Amendment. So again, thank you for joining us today for this important conversation and join with us in the fight for the Sixth Amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.